Right. As I stated, my name is Katie Barron, and I'll be your host for this breakout session. If you are looking for the 2024-25 FAFSA session, you are in the right place. For those of you who don't know me, I am the communication strategist for College Express, and this is my one-year anniversary with Carnegie. However, I came to Carnegie via Claris and had spent 4.5 years with them. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. This is David Winnie, Vice President for Client Strategy. He has 30 years of industry and higher ed experience, not to mention 11 years with McGuire Associates. David is strategic and tactical strategic and tactical aligning data-driven recruitment initiatives, amongst other things, with a goal of delivering decision-making data points. And like most of the other sessions that's been going on, we're going to go ahead and have questions and answers at the end. So I will be monitoring that. And with that, David, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. And also thanks to Steph for her support role in setting all of this up. Good afternoon, y'all. When I was able to, contribute to the Inside Out conference through this session, I thought I drew the short straw at 3 o'clock on a, Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. But there's even a session after this. So without further ado, as Katie said, my name is David Winnie. It's pronounced, if you ever forget, like Winnie the Pooh, even though it's spelled nothing of the sort. And she already had gone through just kind of my background and experience. I've been a practitioner from admissions, financial aid, student services, academic support services in both public and private institutions. But I came to Carnegie about a year ago, working on the financial aid modeling team, or FAO as we call it, which is part of the RMSC division. And we really basically just help institutions understand what their drivers of enrollment are, what the likelihood and probability of enrollment are for both new and returning students. And we do that through the statistical work of our entire team, who are data technicians and data analysts, and we team together to be able to help an institution really uncover what's an opportunity for them, or in some instances where there are risks and vulnerabilities. A big piece of the work that we do, though, is centered on financial aid. And while we talk with institutions about their own institutional aid budgets and how they best deploy scholarships, grants, support services to enroll a particular desired type of student or family, and in the aggregate, a composition of students for an incoming cohort. A linchpin to that is the FAFSA. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the FAFSA before, but it stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And it usually comes out on October the 1st of the year prior to when students are going off to college. And as we sit here today on March 8th, while it did finally roll out, we're still waiting for student level data to reach our institutions. And so there are pretty significant knowledge gaps that have been occurring all cycle as institutions are still actively recruiting, generating applications, making admissions decisions, as well as scholarship award offers and estimated financial aid packages to students. And the starting point for most institutions in this country is, in fact, the FAFSA. Mike Keene, our senior vice president, at an all-staff a couple weeks ago, did a quick walkthrough for about 15 minutes in terms of what the FAFSA is and what some of those changes were. And so this is an adaptation from that presentation. I won't repeat everything to it. I think the most if you've not personally experienced, either yourself or a family member, the financial aid application historically has always looked like and felt like completing a tax return for the U.S. government and the Internal Revenue Service. They've undergone what's known as FAFSA simplification, which within the industry, we've coined the phrase FAFSA complication for reasons which we'll talk about, and things that I'm sure you yourselves are familiar with just by following the news or Twitter or various updates in terms of your own client meetings that you're having with your own institutional partners. Within the FAFSA simplification process, though, it's always, I think, important to kind of take a step back and like, where did all this come from? And so we've listed here, in essence, as far back as 1965, the original Higher Education Act, as amended every 4 or 10 years, whenever they decide to get around to having that negotiated rulemaking process around policy and legislation. And then there are always supplemental acts in statute that are governing, if you will, what the federal financial aid programs are, commonly referred to as Title IV aid programs. These are non-institutional aid dollars. We're talking about the federal Pell Grant, the federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, in some instances, federal work study, TRIO programs to support underserved populations at certain types of institutions, as well as access and affordability issues associated with how each of those aid programs flow to an institution. It's also inclusive of student loan programs and eligibility standards and amounts that individual students or parents could potentially borrow and contribute to what their out-of-pocket expenses would otherwise be at an institution that they choose to enroll at. Reason that I've included some of these kind of background slides is that the slide deck is going to be routed to everybody in the company at the end of the day. And so I'm not going to read through each of these to you. I wanted to kind of have the session stand on its own in terms of kind of just that background if you're interested in reading more. What's really interesting as we look at these statutes, it was back in 2020, December 27th, when this was signed into law. And this was the Appropriations Act that, in essence, designated that Future Act, and it was the law that designated the Simplification Act. And so we've been at this as an industry, as a country, as an industry, as a government, from basically January 1st of 2021. Back in March of 2022, you may recall we were in the midst of a pandemic or starting to come out of that pandemic. And so there was a Technical Corrections Act passed by Congress, which basically modified the terms and conditions of who would qualify for a Pell Grant. It also extended the implementation timeline of what is known as FAFSA simplification. And so this, again, as we sit here on March 8th of 2024, this is not new news for those of us who have kind of dealing with this on a day in and day out basis. We've kind of hit a breaking point in terms of our adaptability, our flexibility. And if any of you know a lot of financial aid administrators, they are not always the warmest or fuzziest group of institutional aid administrators. Some could be transactional, not very transformational. Some can be very accountant stereotype, bean counter type, compliance, regulatory, transactional focused. And so if you take that persona and type and put it across 4,000 colleges and universities dealing with this for 4+ years, you can understand where there are some sensitivities around still this kind of ongoing implementation, if you will. This is actually a slide that I adapted right from a federal government presentation from a couple of years ago. And it just in essence outlines what was occurring or supposed to be occurring in each of the academic years. And so there was a very nice timeline originally put together that just said we're going to address this incrementally. It's a big overhaul. It's in the best interest of students and families, particularly those who are of lower income or have challenges related to their ability to access and afford a college education. And so that timeline did span 3 academic years. Based on that 2022 amendment, we extended it into the 23-24 academic year. What's really interesting as you begin to kind of read through what was supposed to happen in each of these years, everything pretty much occurred, but change has been happening day in and day out, month in and month out for 4+ years. And we're currently actively in the 23-24 academic year and financial aid year. We're all still waiting for data, as I said, related to the 24-25 academic year. So schools and we can assist students and families with understanding, can I afford to go to school A, school B, school C? And when might I begin to understand what my net cost or out-of-pocket responsibility is going to be? Here is just an illustration of that fatigue and frustration factor. It began to set in pretty much immediately because, again, not everybody is embracing of change. But more importantly, with each passing day since October 1 of 2023, when the FAFSA for this year was supposed to roll out, we're sitting here 6.5 months in, still waiting for access on some information and all information related to students. One of the things that changed significantly about the process, which was everything, but if you feel the FAFSA or familiar with phrasing, we used to receive from the government in that application what's known as an expected family contribution. That shifted with FAFSA simplification in 24-25, and what we're waiting for right now is something known as the Student Aid Index. We're not going to dive into specifically what the Student Aid Index is or the methodology formula. There are resources for that. But everything on the FAFSA itself changed. And so that tax return image that Mike Keene had presented, and I included at the start of this deck, that changed from over 100 questions to basically 46 online questions, because we've also eliminated the paper FAFSA from being an option. Everything is electronic. It's going to be fewer questions, though, through the use of technology and the use of skip logic based on how families have responded to certain questions, but some other significant things changed with the methodology and the calculation that we're all awaiting to see. We've removed what's known industry-wide as the sibling discount, so no longer is the methodology taking into account how many family members within a household are enrolled in college. That's going to have impact on returning students in particular who went to college perhaps with a brother or a sister or a family member within that household, who are in essence dividing a family's ability to pay by 2 or 3, in essence, how the old methodology approached. Under this new approach, they're not taking into account that sibling discount or that multifamily member. And so the impact just out of the gate is that each student on his or own behalf is going to have their own student aid index calculation. And it's reasonable to believe that their families that have multiple students in college are going to need to be working individually with the colleges and schools that they've applied to and been admitted to try to make sure that they are maintained whole in terms of what their net cost was when they chose that school and what their net cost is now, given the change mid-cycle of their college enrollment process. These other things that are listed here are kind of more technical in nature, but they're aspects of the methodology that is ultimately changed. We've put down here really what we're waiting to see. A student aid index can now go from anywhere from a negative 1,500 to the students and families most neediest in the country, all the way up to basically $1 million. Historically, and for the last 3 decades, basically, the EFC was always at a 0 or up to $100,000. And so this shift here is pretty significant because hidden within the methodology itself are aspects around a family's income, a family's assets, inclusive this year for the first time, business and farm income if it's your primary place of residence. And so different input values around a family's ability to pay are being factored into the methodology. And because the federal government has not been timely or accurate in some of its methodology preparation, all of the information that has been out has actually been inaccurate in terms of that student aid index calculation. Yes, there were estimators available to institutions. Yes, there were estimator platforms available for us to plan and to utilize, and we've certainly utilized those. But it was just a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, that the Department of Education finally updated one element of the methodology, which related to an inflation adjustment for student income specifically. And so when they finally made that update in late February, that changed the student aid index, which everybody has been using as an estimate. And so we are still now waiting for that updated student aid index to be able to check ourselves against whether or not that estimate was very accurate, similar, or very wrong. And because we have no student data yet 6 months in, impacted our prospective students who are waiting to understand the outcome of a financial aid application, impacted our all returning students who may have already gone through the process of completing that FAFSA. They keep telling us that the information's coming and we're getting close, but this just is a kind of quick word cloud around what students and parents back in October of 2023 already thought about the FAFSA and thought about the process of applying for financial aid. NASFA did this with support from the Bill Gates Foundation, and they're planning on continuing to do various focus groups and research, particularly about the impact of this year's FAFSA and the impact of the delays that we've all experienced. Systems and specifications changes underlying all of the simplification effort are still changing. We turn on basically our professional industry, networks, distribution lists, professional association websites every day to see what's the latest and breaking news. Back on November 15th of 2023, so a month and a half after the FAFSA was supposed to have launched, they're sending out information to us about what the simplified process is still going to be and where it has changed already 6-7 weeks late from deployment. You can see just here through the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, as recently as March 5th, the Department of Education details ISER processing approach in new announcement. The ISER stands for the Student Information Record. And so when a family completes the FAFSA, it's being processed supposedly by the federal government, and what an institution receives if a student and parent has listed that college's school code on there, the institution will ultimately download from the government an institutional information record. And that is the results of that student's FAFSA application and data file, data field layout. It's changing pretty much every week. They did say recently that it was the final file layout spec for the ISERs, but the impact is significant because as those specifications change, most of our institutions, if not all, are working with some type of ERP system. They're certainly working with some sort of software system. And so the government has created additional mechanisms because of the simplification process that is now retrieving data directly from the IRS. No longer does a student or family have to input their own information that's already available in the IRS database. There's a matching process through this application that allows, in essence, the Department of Education to go and grab that IRS-related information and help the family simplify their inputs by matching that together and processing the FAFSA. That created an entire additional layer of privacy and security. And so the government had to, in essence, create additional systems that the financial aid community at schools are downloading, learning, and still adjusting, because on March 4th, they let the institutions know that release number 1 of that new software system that they have to use to download the ISERs, that was just made available to them with a specification correction. So we're still in the week in which they're just rolling out some of the essential tools required by institutions to be able to download an ISER, let alone that ISER is not yet available. I started this data point because there have been starts and stops to this process for 4 years, most specifically back in October, November, and December, when they kept on delaying when the FAFSA would be available for students to begin filling out. What they're telling us now this week is that even when they begin to push out these ISERs to institutions, it's going to be a slow rollout. They don't want to kind of push out 100% of them just from a production standpoint. They're going to be testing along the way, but they're also going to start stopping the ability of some students from completing the FAFSA, which is the absolute wrong thing to do, as everybody is pushing students and families to complete a FAFSA given all of the challenges that we faced. The countdown is on. If you're familiar with the normal TikTok, May 1, the national candidate reply date, literally from today, that's 54 days. You've heard about institutions and states moving that extension deadline in terms of that deposit date for students and families. But the other impact that's happening here is that there's a heck of a lot of work to do at the institution in order to be able to put a financial aid package in the hands of our students and families for them to be able to make an enrollment decision or return to school next year in terms of what's going to be affordable or not. And so 54 days is certainly not enough time to get all that work done. When included in that are our banner, Elution, colleagues, institutional partners, Salesforce partners, Workday partners, system known as the name is escaping me right now, PowerFade's old College Board product. Each of those systems also need those file specifications from the government, and they just got the final release last week in terms of what that ICER file layout is going to be. And so until our vendor partners update their own systems, push out patches to information technology teams on our campuses, the financial aid office and the ERP is not available to import that data yet. And so irrespective of when the government finally pushes out an ICER, are our institutional partners ready to receive that information? And so much is dependent on all of these pieces of the puzzle coming back together. Down here at the very end, as I try to move to close and open this up to you for any questions that you may have, once we get that data, ideally an institution is going to run internal testing. Absolutely essential are any potential auto packaging algorithms that they've built in, specifically related to federal compliance and regulatory disbursement issues, but also related to an institutional aid budget in terms of scholarship support, grant support, etc. And so as we receive information about what the student aid index number is, how has that shifted the demonstrated need profile of our prospective student pool who we've admitted? How has that shifted the demonstrated need pool of our returning students? And if we have an X amount of money to spend as a budget line item in institutional aid scholarships and grants, how is that apportioned over the admitted pool and the returning student pool that we have to analyze and make adjustments to in many instances before we can push the letter out the door to the student and the parent who have been anxiously awaiting for this information for 6, 7, 8 months. And so while the government is in essence trying to get it right, and they need to, and we're still waiting, May 1 is coming, June 1 extended deposit deadline is coming, and there's still a heck of a lot of work that needs to kind of all still come together for this to, in essence, not continue to be a really anxious and frustrating time for anybody that's working in the space that we work in terms of overall, support of them, but also in the financial aid modeling team of FAO. We're actually building predictive models based on prior year history. And so while we're able to do a lot with our data sets and our institutional partners right now with their year-to-date activity, the critical pieces about yield and forecasting and accuracy is going to come down to demonstrated need levels, the number of students who file a FAFSA and who a school and that school receives that FAFSA result on, and how does that fit or align with assumptions that we've made about this incoming 2024 cohort. So there's still quite a lot to work through. And with each passing day, it's kind of truncating our timeline. Open it up at this point. I don't know if there are questions in the chat. I haven't been following the chat.
There haven't been any questions. If folks want to either unmute themselves and ask David directly, or if you'd rather put it in the chat, either works. So there is a question. David, are you able to see that?
If I put my glasses on, I can.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, you can only see part of it. It's a great question. We talk about this pretty much each week in our client partner calls about should we be doing estimates? If so, to what degree? There are some institutions that we partner with that had made either prior to this entire simplification process or as a result of the simplification process and the delays, they use what's known as the CSS profile, which is a more complex, more comprehensive financial profile of a student or family. It's widely used and has been for years. The institutions that have access and had built that profile into their, I guess, process, those institutions have been pushing out estimated and actual financial aid packages to their student populations. The problem is in part that not all institutions use it. Some students and families will not be able to afford to submit the profile because it's a fee-based service. And the profile, while it gives you an estimated student aid index for schools to be able to use, what was the problem with that estimate is that the government just updated the index for inflation, which they had failed to do prior. And so all of the estimated student aid indexes that have been out there and being used are flawed. To what degree is that going to shift students' estimated financial aid award or the package that they've seen? For some students, it's going to give them additional Pell Grant eligibility, or it may move some high need students into federal Pell Grant eligibility. That's a good thing. For some students, it may move them out of high need based grants. And so time will tell in terms of that impact. If in fact the government, which they say they are doing by the first half of March, if they begin to release the ICER data to the schools, there's not enough time to develop an estimator substitute for our institutional partners. And so we've been basically, as our own blog post released a few weeks back, suggested communicating with the students and families about where we are in the process, making sure that they are aware of the fact that this is not on an individual institution, it's countrywide, keeping them informed and engaged with the institution in terms of affinity building, relationship building. That's the best that they can do. In our client partner meetings, we've encouraged them to shift resources to merit-based or gift aid programs more so than a heavy need-based award this year. Many institutions have taken that approach. And then others have actually utilized those student aid estimators that are publicly available, irrespective of the fact that we now know that they're wrong. Some institutions have embraced those early on and began rolling out their total packages to those students.
JD says thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
I feel like any day, I looked right before I logged on to this session. I'm like, are there any new announcements that I can quickly dump into the, new slide here in the slide deck? But I didn't see anything. I really secretly hoping that, the Department of Ed had learned its lesson and rather than overpromise and underdeliver, that they would actually underpromise and overdeliver. So I was somewhat hoping that the financial aid community would actually today receive their first kind of batch of downloadable information student records. And that does not seem to have occurred. But because of what I had shared earlier about some of the vendors who are supporting institutional ERP systems, they're still working on updates that they're needing to push out into their institutions. And so there's kind of this stepwise approach that's required, or a ladder, if you will, in terms of kind of the pecking order of what has to happen first, second, and third in order for an institution to actually download that information and begin to do the actionable data work required to be able to understand what is in front of it. I think, JD, a second part of your question was about the extension of the deadline. Some institutions, the far majority of institutions, don't close their class on May 1. So there's a percentage of highly selective, there's a percentage of other types of institutions that always kind of drive towards May 1. All of those schools and even most of all of our partners, even they recruit students and manage summer melt throughout the entirety of the summer. They're so tuition dependent and headcount dependent that they're not going to turn away a student unless they truly have a capacity issue. And so rather than adjust specific deadline dates, what they've communicated to their students is that we're going to remain available, we're going to remain flexible, we're not going to rescind offers of scholarships that we previously made. If an institution has a different paradigm because they're highly selective or they're reaching capacity, that institution is going to continue to message out. In California, where we do have partners in the financial aid optimization team, we have 3 or 4 that we work with. A big shift out in California was that the entire CU and SU system went to a June 1 deadline extension. And so they've already made that announcement weeks ago. Our institutional partners are certainly aware of that. Our private partners are impacted every year by what the public sector in California does in terms of who they take in regular decision admission cycles, who they take off wait lists. And so there's always this kind of pecking order of movement that will occur from May 1 through next September. The impact of that really is unknown. And because so much of our forecasting model is predicated on FAFSA filer volume and the demonstrated need level of those who file a FAFSA, those 2 big pieces of information are unknown to us and our institutions. And so it's really difficult for us to stand behind convincingly and with confidence a particular forecast or a particular projection.
Well, I think that is the time for our session here. I think if anyone has any follow-up questions, David, I'm guessing you'd be available to answer them on Slack.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, everyone, happy Friday. We'll see you in the next session. Have a great weekend.